Hotep family, you're tuning into the pro-black perspective on KWAZ radio, and we're going to continue this deep reading of the Wretched of the Earth. This is episode 6 of 20, pages 60 to 72. I hope you enjoy your stay, as well as you check out the other podcasts on the network, including Harsh Reality Podcast, Bitter Medicine Podcast, and of course the Revolutionary Matron. I'm gonna say good morning to everybody who's just waking up, or who hasn't been told good morning just yet, and we're gonna jump right into it. So, page 60 of the Wretched of the Earth. And by the way, if you want this book, it's freely available, for a long time. And of course, if you need assistance in finding the link, definitely check out the description and do your own investigation. But Franz Fanon continues. He says, in fact, the Western financiers are wary of any form of risk-taking. Their demands, therefore, are for political stability and a peaceful social climate, which are impossible to achieve given the appalling situation of the population as a whole in the aftermath of independence. In their search, then, for a guarantee which the former colony cannot vouch for, they demand that certain military bases be kept on and the young nation enter into military and economic agreements. The private companies put pressure on their own governments to ensure that the troops stationed in those countries are assigned to protecting their interests. As a last resort, these companies require the government to guarantee their investment in such and such an underdeveloped region. Now, just jumping in, just getting a random paragraph, you realize that what he's talking about. Basically, it's like this. If you're a financier, right, you want to undertake an endeavor in another country, right? You want political stability, okay? You want a peaceful social climate. You want... and if not, you want to demand a military base on that country in order to guarantee that. The example that you can look at, for instance, is in South Africa. If I am or even like you go into the hood of America, regardless of where you go, you have to understand that if people are going to do business in your area, they do not want that business looted. They don't want their property stolen. They don't want their businesses burned. Because when you're doing business, what you're doing is you're going into an area, investing a lot of money, training a lot of personnel, exacting a lot of costs, sometimes building different buildings, oftentimes shipping equipment and materials and supplies and inventory over to that location. To not garner a profit from that, or to have it stolen and destroyed, is not something that you would want from the perspective of you acting in another country, right? And I tell you this, it's actually kind of sad. I'm a little disappointed, but black people do not understand this. They do not understand this. I actually saw, oh my gosh, it's actually kind of sad, but I saw this post from, a respectable Haitian individual, and actually a couple of respectable Haitian individuals. And they were saying, hey, we would like China to come in and, help us out or whatever. And it's like, even without using the experience of other countries that have China help them out, China would follow this same pattern, because this is the pattern that you're supposed to follow. This is the pattern that is like, if I want to do business in Africa as an African person, I would want that business protected. The big difference between me and another people, however, is that I'm okay with an African policing or African military. The Chinese are better off are more favorable towards the Chinese military. The French are more favorable towards the French military. And if you're putting military on other people's land, understand what that really implies. You understand what that really implies, but it is what it is. I don't even want to engage in it, because it's just a little disappointing. But we're going to keep going. As a result, few countries meet the conditions required by the cartels and monopolies. So the capital, deprived of reliable outlets, remains blocked in Europe and frozen, especially as the capital refused to invest in their own country. Returns in this case are in fact minimal, and the fiscal pressure disheartens the boldest. The situation in the long term is catastrophic. Capital no longer circulates, or else is considerably reduced. The Swiss banks refuse funding, and Europe suffocates. Despite the enormous sums swallowed up by military expenditures, international capitalism is in desperate straits. So, of course, in 1950, he's saying international capitalism in desperate straits, and now it's flourishing. But that's another. But that's like again, that's the socialists being confused, you know. But another danger looms on the horizon. Since the third world was abandoned and condemned to regression, in any case, stagnation, to the selfishness and immorality of the West, the underdeveloped people decide to establish a collective autarky. The industries of the West are rapidly deprived of their overseas outlets. Capital goods pile up in the warehouses, and the European market witnesses the inexorable rivalry between financiers and cartels. Factory closures, layoffs, and unemployment force the European proletariat to engage in an open struggle with the capitalist regime. This is what I was talking about, why the Europe is now entertaining welfare states, because you do not want the proletariat in struggle with the capitalists, you know? And the way how you avoid that is you give people social welfare. And this is something that even Lenin outlined, you know, in 1914 or whatever. The monopolies then realized that their true interests lie in aiding and massively aiding without too many conditions the underdeveloped countries. It is clear, therefore, that the young nations of the third world are wrong to grovel at the feet of the capitalist countries. We are powerful in our own right and the justness of our position. It is our duty, however, to tell and explain to the capitalist countries that they are wrong to think the fundamental issue of our time is the war between the socialist regime and them. At the end, an end must be put to this Cold War that goes us nowhere. The molecular arms race must be stopped, and the non-developed regions must receive generous investments and technical aid. The fate of the world depends on the response given to this question. So again, you know, you kind of see, like right here, it says the underdeveloped regions must receive generous investments and technical aid. You know, you kind of see how, at the end of the day, the socialist mentality is kind of just begging the capitalists, you know? And like nobody sees anything wrong with that, but there's something incredibly wrong with it. And I mean, like again, like the situation for African people is pretty damn tragic. Because like I said, I saw somebody last night. I was just minding my business, and someone put up this post on how China should get itself involved in Haiti. You know, and it was just like, what? You know, like black people are begging foreigners to colonize them to the point where it's not even a surprise that they are colonized. You know, if you can so easily find someone to beg to be colonized. You could so easily find someone to beg to be colonized that at this point it's not even like it's depressing. At this point, it's depressing. And it is pointless for the capitalist regime to try and implicate the socialist regimes in the fate of Europe, confronted by the starving multitudes of colored peoples. Colonel Gagarin exploits whenever General de Gaulle thinks is not a feat which does credit to Europe. For some time now, the leaders of the capitalist regime and their intellectuals have an ambivalent attitude towards the Soviet Union. After having joined forces to eliminate the social regime, they now realize they have to come to terms with it. So they switch on the smiles, multiply the overtures, and make constant reminders to the Soviet people that they are part of Europe. Brandishing the third world as a flood which threatens to engulf the whole of Europe will not divide the progressive forces whose intentions are to lead humanity into the pursuit of happiness. The third world has no intention of organizing a vast hunger crusade against Europe. What it does expect from those who have kept it in slavery for centuries is to help it rehabilitate man and ensure his triumph everywhere, once and for all. Again, you know, like this is just depressing. Like again, like, oh my gosh, I'm actually gonna screenshot this. I'm actually gonna screenshot this and just be like, like black folk, like we are, like we lost, you know, we lost 50 years ago. I'm gonna actually gonna, I'm actually gonna post that. By the way, if you're not following my Twitter, uh, make sure you check it out at Onitaset. But yeah, we lost 50 years ago. But it is obvious we are not so naive. Sorry, I pressed the wrong button. I wanted to take off this picture. All right. But it is obvious we are not so naive as to think this will be achieved with the cooperation and goodwill of the European governments. This colossal task, which consists of reintroducing man into the world, man in his totality, will be achieved with the crucial help of the European masses, who would do well to confess that they have often rallied behind the position of our common masters on colonial issue. In order to do this, the European masses must first of all decide to wake up, put on their thinking caps, and stop playing the irresponsible game of Sleeping Beauty. So, I mean, like, you get it. If you don't get it by now, like, if you, sometimes you say to yourself, well, Oni, why are you not socialist? You know, why aren't you, are you a capitalist and blah, blah, blah. No, my belief is that African people should be nationalists in the sense of we should have an independent-minded mentality. You know, this idea that, oh my gosh, this is like depressing. This idea that it's not the European government but the European masses that will save African people is probably the most backward, confusing ideology on the planet, and it's sad. Because, Franz Fanon is a respectable and respected individual, but yet it's sad that this is what we have central to our belief system. We have central to our school of thought is this idea of another people saving us. So yeah, it's not even like I can't even, I can't even. But we're going to go on. That was the first chapter on violence. Now we go to the second chapter, which is grandeur and weakness of spontaneity. So these reflections on violence have made us realize the frequent discrepancy between the cadres of the Nationalist Party and the masses, and the way they are out of step with each other. In any union on political organization, there is a traditional gap between the masses who demand an immediate, unconditional improvement of their situation and the cadres who gauge the difficulties likely to be created by employers, put a restraint on their demands. Hence the oft-remarked tenacious discontent of the masses with regard to the cadres. After a day of demonstration, while the cadres are celebrating victory, the masses well and truly get the feeling that they have been betrayed. It is the repeated demonstration of their rights and the repeated labor disputes that politicize the masses. Sorry, I think that dazed out because, like this is the kind of writing, like this kind of block text is something that you want to avoid in your own writing, by the way. You don't want to just hammer on a bunch of words and a bunch of ideas in these block texts. But, we're going to try to get through this slowly. These reflections on violence have made us realize the frequent discrepancy between the cadres of the Nationalist Party, so that's the leading party, the party, whatever, and the masses, and the way they're out of step with each other. So he's, saying back when he was talking about violence, he was saying that the Nationalist parties are often not advocating for violence. And of course, you're not going to advocate for violence or unstructured violence if you are the structure. You know what I mean? You're not going to be anti-government if you are, in fact, the government. That's a stupid idea. And that's one of the things that people think is a big contradiction. They're like, oh, like, for instance, in America, they're like, oh, the Democrats are not going to want to tear down the structure. It's like, no, because they are the Nationalist Party. Well, not Nationalist Party, but they are the Liberal Party. They're the party in power. Why would they want to disseminate the power? That's stupid. They have the power, right? Anyway, please, in any union or political organization, there's a traditional gap between the masses who demand an immediate, unconditional improvement of the situation and the cadres, i.e. the parties, who, gauging the difficulties likely to be created by employers, put a restraint on their demands. So the idea is that, you have to I'll put it this way: the Vice President Pence, allegedly, the Vice President of America was Pence, Mike Pence. Allegedly, after he lost this election, he had nowhere to go, nowhere to live. The reality is that if you are a part of this cadre of this political party, after your party is out of power, you don't really have anywhere to be. You're the minister of transportation, and then you're replaced by another minister of transportation, then suddenly you don't have anything that you had before, because everything you had was connected with that job. So you and of course the finances. So what you need to do is you need to appeal to the political parties. To the political patrons, and that would be the employers in a sense, because the workers or the individuals are not really given that much. Sure, they might give $100, right? But the other person's giving 100,000. You understand? So unless you have 1,000 workers giving $100, which you don't, and you're more likely to have 1,000 business people giving $100,000. You understand? That's what you have. Cadres who blah, 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 blah. So hence the oft-remarked tenacious discontent of the masses with regard to the cadres. After a day of demonstration, while the cadres are celebrating victory, the masses well and truly get the feeling they have been betrayed. It is the repeated demonstrations for their rights and the repeated labor disputes that politicize the masses. So if you keep on, demonstrating for your rights and whatever, that's how you get politicized. A politically informed union official is someone who knows that a local dispute is not a crucial confrontation between him and management. The colonized intellectual, who in their respective metropolises have studied the mechanisms of political party, established similar organizations so as to mobilize the masses, and put pressure on the colonial administration. The formation of nationalist parties in the colonized countries is contemporary with the birth of an intellectual and business elite. These elite attach primordial importance to the organization as such, and blind devotion to the organization often takes priority over a rational study of colonial society. The notion of party is a notion imported from the metropolis. This instrument of modern resistance is grafted onto a protean, unbalanced reality where slavery, bondage, barter, cottage industries, and stock transactions exist side by side. So yeah, he's just saying that the metropolis, the cities import their ideologies into the new circumstances, but these new circumstances are like very grafted. There are multiple economic systems happening side by side, and we know this. This is the world. The weakness of political parties lies not only in their mechanical imitation of an organization, which is used to handling the struggle of the proletariat within a highly industrialized capitalist society. Innovations and adaptations should have been made to the type of organization at a local level. The great mistake and the inherent flaw of most of the political parties in the underdevelopment region has been traditionally to address first and foremost the most politically conscious elements, the urban proletariat, the smallest tradesmen, and the civil servants, i.e. a tiny section of the population, which represents barely more than 1%. So I guess he's saying that in certain societies, the political party is more so geared towards like capitalist countries. A capitalist country will have a large population of proletariat. But today, obviously, we have, the West is not necessarily into manufacturing anymore. More so, it's shifting towards a service economy. And so even then, like, you see the outmoded classification there, right? Anyway, but like in these economies, he might be saying that they're more so agriculture, So he says, however, like says to say peasants as opposed to proletariat, which are two different economic systems, two different economic classes. It says, however, although the proletariat understood the party propaganda and read its publication, it was much less prepared to respond to any slogans taking up the unrelenting struggle for national liberation. It has been said many times that in colonial territories, the proletariat is the kernel of the colonized people, most pampered by the colonial regime. The embryonic urban proletariat is relatively privileged. In the capitalist countries, the proletariat has nothing to lose and possibly everything to gain. In the colonized country, the proletariat has everything to lose. It represents, in fact, that fraction of the colonized who are indispensable for running the colonial machine: tram drivers, taxi drivers, miners, dockers, interpreters, and nurses. These elements must make up the most loyal clientele of the nationalist parties, and by the privileged position they occupy in the colonial system, represent the bourgeois fraction of the colonized population. So again, it's a little bit of confusion, a little bit of like kind of, it's like it's weird because you're using the paradigm of Marx, and this is the thing that a lot of us do. We use the paradigm of Marx where a proletariat is somebody who's working in the manufacturing center, and they have nothing. They have everything to gain, nothing to lose, right? And what he's saying is that no, the proletariat inside of a colony situation is not necessarily the manufacturer, because there's not really that much manufacturing going on. There's not really too much manufacturing going on in Africa per se. But the proletariat, then he says, would be the tram driver, taxi driver, miners, dockers, interpreters, and nurses. Now, actually, if you really look into it, those are called petty bourgeoisie. You understand? Those are called petty bourgeoisie. They're not proletariat. And again, but you see, now you're confusing things. Now you're confusing things because like it kind of shows you why Marxism is outmoded and outdated, and like particular to a heavily industrialized economy. And when you put it out and you say, oh, well, a taxi driver is a proletariat, they're not, right? But here he's also saying the taxi driver is a bourgeoisie. He's not. The taxi driver, like remember, a bourgeoisie is somebody who owns the means of production. The taxi driver would be a petty bourgeoisie in this paradigm. Why? Because the petty bourgeoisie is not a proletariat, but they're not a bourgeoisie. Like there's basically, in the Marxist paradigm, there's four castes. There's a lumpen proletariat, who would be basically the unemployed, like the scavengers in a sense. And then the petty bourgeoisie would be pretty much like the self-employed, or pretty much the people who are in employment, like the shopkeeper and all that kind of stuff. They're in employment, but they're not, like they're either self-employed or they're employed in a small, in a thing that's unrelated to manufacturing. So like miners technically are, like that's a tough call, like technically they would be petty bourgeoisie as well. But that's why I said, it's really important to, like, it's kind of important to just let go of this physical capital paradigm, It's important to let go of that paradigm because the whole thing is kind of confusing. How is a miner the same as a teacher, the same as a nurse, same as a tram driver? But you see, I'm saying petty bourgeoisie, and you see that Franz Fanon is saying, oh, they're bourgeoisie, when clearly they're not bourgeoisie, but also even petty bourgeoisie kind of silly. It sounds silly, you're digging down in the mine, I mean, yeah. Technically though, I would probably put the miner into the proletariat, maybe. But again, it's like a dumb paradigm. So everything is kind of twisted in that sense, right? So he says, so it's understandable that the clientele. So basically, he's saying that these, like the people in the political party here that are being appealed to, because there's not really a huge industrial section, are essentially the petty bourgeoisie. And of course that's a problem somehow, but it's not really, but he thinks it's a problem. So it is understandable that the clientele of the nationalist parties is above all urban technicians, manual workers, intellectuals, and tradespeople living mainly in the towns. Their way of thinking in many ways already bears the mark of the technically advanced and relatively comfortable environment in which they live. Here, modernism is king. These are the very same circles which will oppose obscureness traditions and propose innovations, thereby entering into open conflict with the old granite foundation that is national heritage. But of course, he's basically saying, like, basically what it is that, let's say you're a nurse, and let's say national heritage is saying, no, we need to go back, forget the Western ways, forget the white man's ways. We don't need nurses, we need medicine people, right? A lot of people who have experienced nursing and nurses and all that kind of stuff, and he's saying even nurses are going to say, maybe we don't need to go back to medicine people. Maybe we don't need to go back to that. And a part of that is, obviously you have a Western education bias where you're bombarded by Western education to think that a medicine person is, like pretty much experimenting on you, and the nurse is more relying on earlier experiments of other people. Now, of course, maybe both groups are relying on, or ordinary experiments of other people, but at the same time, like, you get it. I mean, I get it. You like we get it that that maybe that's like it's an understandable response to think, like from a nurse's perspective, oh, I actually do like nursing, or from like a programmer's perspective, they're like, we do want electricity, we do want satellites, we do want access to the internet, you know, like we don't need to necessarily go back to a time when we didn't have internet, when we didn't have electricity, when the sun decided whether it was bright or not, or lamps, like oil lamps or something. The large majority of the nationalist parties regard the rural masses with great mistrust. These masses give them the impression of being mired in inertia and sterility. Fairly quickly, the nationalist party members, the urban workers and intellectuals, end up passing the same pejorative judgment on the peasantry as the colonists. In our endeavor to understand the reasons for this distrust of the rural masses by the political parties, we should not forget that colonialism has often strengthened or established its domination by an organized petrification of the peasantry, regimented by marabouts, witch doctors, and traditional chiefs. Right? Okay. The rural masses still live in a feudal state whose overbearing medieval structure is nurtured by the colonial administrators and army. You understand that basically the colonists kept purposely wanted African people to be feudal outside of them, but that's to be expected. You do not one thing in life is that you don't want strong enemies. You do not want strong enemies. You do not want to fight enemies in their prime. You do not want to fight enemies that are capable. If I must fight somebody, I would rather fight somebody smaller than me. That's just my preference. If I have to fight somebody, it would be somebody smaller than me. Yeah. Why would you fight somebody bigger than you? What's the point? What do you have to prove in losing sensations in your face? What do you have to prove with a broken arm? Kofi says greetings. Greetings, Kofi. Hotep. Respect. All right, so the young national bourgeoisie, especially the business sector, now competes with the feudal rulers in a number of areas. Marabouts and witch doctors prevent the sick from consulting a physician. The rulings of the gemmas make lawyers redundant. The Qaids use their political and administrative powers to launch a trucking business or establish a commerce. The local chiefs oppose the introduction of trade and new products in the name of religion and tradition. So you see this too. He says the young national bourgeoisie, especially the business sector, now competes with the feudal rulers in a number of areas. Sorry, I drank some water and that happens. Marabouts and witch doctors. So he's like, if you're a physician, the witch doctors, whatever, preventing you. The rulings of gemmas, make the lawyers redundant and all that kind of stuff. So, there's this clash. And like I said, if you have an economic clash, there's eventually an economic war. The young class of colonized businessmen and traders needs to eliminate these prohibitions and barriers in order to grow. The indigenous clientele, which represents the exclusive preserve of the feudal overlords and sees itself more or less banned from purchasing new products, constitutes therefore a market which both parties are fighting for. The feudal agents form a barrier between the young westernized nationalists and the masses. Every time the elite makes a gesture towards the rural masses, the tribal chiefs, the religious rulers, and the traditional authorities issue repeated warnings, threats, and excommunications. These traditional authorities, sanctioned by the occupying power, feel threatened by the growing endeavors of the elite to infiltrate the rural masses. They know too well that the ideas imported by the urban elements are likely to threaten the very existence of their feudal authority. As a result, their enemy is not the occupying power with whom, in fact, they get along very well, but these modernists who are bent on dislocating the indigenous society and so doing so take the bread out of their mouths. So again, if you're in the feudal society, if you're in any economic system, and you're on the top, you do not want another economic system to have its place among you. You know, you want, you want, like, you do not want that, you know? And so what happened with the colonial system is that the colonizer would come into Africa, and they would recognize the feudal authority and say, hey, you want to keep these black folk backwards? We have the same thing. Like, we have something in common. You know what I mean? Like, I fully support you on keeping black folk backwards, right? But the modernist, the modern African who's saying, you know what, we don't necessarily need to do that, or even if they want to advance in their life, like they want to sell cars to people in villages, they want to sell cars, they want to pave roads, they want to do all that kind of stuff. If they are going to do that, then that's where the feudal, the chiefs and so forth are saying to themselves, no, we like that's where the clash comes in. I'm just explaining that. The bread out of their mouths. So you end up taking the bread out of their mouths. You know what I mean? Because if they're getting, you just end up taking the bread out of their mouths. Like, if they're suddenly driving around, they're not doing what you need them to do. If they're going on vacation in 10 cities over, your population is depopulated. If they're working in the mines, for instance, because you might want people working in the mines. If they're working in the mines, then the women are left defenseless because the men are gone. Then that's what happens. That's what happened. The westernized elements, feelings towards the peasant masses recall those found among the proletariat in the industrialized nations. The history of bourgeois revolutions and the history of proletarian revolutions have demonstrated that the peasant masses often represent a curb on revolution. In the industrialized countries, the peasant masses are generally the least politically conscious, the least organized, as well as the most anarchistic elements. They are characterized by a series of features: individualism, lack of discipline, the love of money, fits of rage, and deep depression. Definitely an objectively reactionary behavior. We have seen that the nationalist parties base their methods and doctrines on the Western parties, and therefore, in the majority of cases, do not direct their propaganda at the rural masses. In fact, a rational analysis of colonial society would have shown them that the colonized peasants live in a traditional environment whose structures have remained intact, whereas the industrialized countries, it is these traditional circles which have been splintered by the progress of industrialization. It is within the burgeoning proletariat that we find individualistic behavior in the colonies. Abandoning the countryside and its insoluble problems of demography, the landless peasants, now a lumpen proletariat, are driven into towns, crammed into shanty towns, and endeavor to infiltrate the ports and cities, the creations of colonial domination. As for the mass of peasantry, they continue to live in a petrified context, and those who cannot scrape a living in the countryside have no other choice but to emigrate to the cities. The peasant who stays put is a staunch defender of tradition, and in a colonial society represents the element of discipline whose social structure remains community-minded. Such a static society clinging to a rigid context can, of course, sporadically generate episodes of religious fanaticism and tribal warfare, but in their spontaneity, the rural masses remain disciplined and altruistic. The individual steps aside in favor of the community. So, of course, this is a praise of peasants. One thing that I picked up on with regard to Franz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth is that he believes that the peasant is a revolutionary class. And, that's just nonsense that this nonsense Western kind of notion that there is this revolutionary class. Either way, he has this praise of, he's saying that the peasant maintain their traditions and maintain their ways, and it's more so the proletariat or the city people who have, abandoned their way, and they're more individualistic as opposed to the noble, community-minded peasant. And of course, this is all just nonsense. It's really all just nonsense. The goal of African people is to develop their own nations, to stop trying to live off of the colony of other people, and to actually want to live off other people's colonies. Stop trying to and start living off of their own, off the strength of their own convictions. We don't see that, and Fanon's not even advocating that. He's advocating for the Western colonizers to return and do better, which is just ridiculous. You're a grown man, You're a grown man and you've become a respectable ancestor, although not ancestor of any of us because he's a misogynist, but still. Uh, but like the thing is that yeah, it's ridiculous. The peasants distrust the town dweller dressed like a European, speaking his language, working alongside him, sometimes living in his neighborhood. He is considered by the president to be a renegade who has given up everything which constitutes the national heritage. The town dweller is a traitor, a mercenary. And this is the thing that, realistically speaking, this is most of us. Like right now, I'm speaking in the colonizer's damn language. Right now I'm dressed like a damn European. You understand? Right now, you could say I'm working in his neighborhood and sometimes living in his neighborhood, working alongside him and sometimes living like the peasant should look at me suspiciously. Like I'm not gonna say I'm not a traitor or a mercenary, but I could see why somebody would say, "Hey, but wait a moment, what language are you speaking?" And the thing is that it applies to Fanon too. What language is he speaking? Well, he wrote this in French, but that's another colonizer's language. The town dweller is a traitor and a mercenary. A mercenary basically means somebody who's paid for hire. Right? We like we're not volunteers for the cause of our people. We are mercenaries. Who apparently gets along very well with the occupier and strives to succeed in the context of the colonial system. He's not even lying. Like, it makes sense. And that's partly why you want to go relearn your own language and relearn your own culture, but really also escape this colonial system. Give up on the colonial system, because what are you working alongside? You're working side by side with this white boy. You're working side by side with this white boy, speaking this white boy's language. Una sema Kiswahili, that's what I would say. But anyway, you sitting by, working with him, living with him, and then, you're like, oh yeah, well, I'm the one who's gonna change this world. No, you don't know. But anyway, hence the reason why we often hear the peasants say that the town dwellers have no moral standards. This is not the traditional opposition between town and country. It is the opposition between the colonized excluded from the benefits of colonialism and their counterparts who manage to turn the colonial system to their advantage. The colonialists, moreover, use this antagonism in their opposition to the Nationalist Party. They mobilize the population in the mountains and the interior against the urban population. They set the back country against the coast. They revive tribal identities, and it should come as no surprise to see Kalanduji, crowned king of Kasai, some years back, the Assembly of Chiefs in Ghana, hold its ground against Nkrumah. So, white people were like, hey, you know what? Nkrumah's, doing all this. He's, speaking his English language. He's doing all that stuff. I mean, obviously he knew Tree as well, but so on and so forth. And the Council of Chiefs, the Assembly of Chiefs in Ghana is like, oh no, this guy, he's, yeah, but he's really just trying to modernize and trying to get rid of a traditional blah, blah, blah. And Nkrumah probably was. Because, if you're doing that socialist stuff, that's what you're trying to do anyway. But, we'll continue. The political parties are unable to establish roots in the countryside. Instead of adapting the existing structures in order to invest them with nationalist or progressive elements, they are intent on disrupting traditional existence within the context of the colonial system. They imagine they can jump. See, again, if you're expanding the white boys system, the white boys colonial system, then you already have a problem. You already have a problem. They imagine they can jumpstart the nation, whereas the mesh of the colonial system is still tightly interlocked. They make no effort to reach out to the masses. They do not place their theoretical knowledge at the service of the people, but instead try to regiment the masses according to a predetermined schema. Consequently, they parachute into the villages inexperienced or unknown leaders from the capital who, empowered by the central authorities, endeavor to manage the dower or the village like a company committee. The traditional chiefs are ignored, sometimes taken down a peg. Instead of integrating the history of the village and the conflicts between tribes and clans into the people's struggle, the history of the future nation has a singular disregard for minor local histories and tramples on the only thing relevant to the nation's actuality. The elders, held in respect in traditional societies and generally invested with an undeniable moral authority, are publicly ridiculed. The occupiers' services have no scruples making use of the Occupied surfaces has no scruple making use of the ensuring resentment and are kept informed of the slightest decision adopted by this caricature of authority. A well-informed police repression based on factual intelligence gathering is quick to follow. The leaders parachuted in from the outside and the main members of the new assembly are arrested. So you get it. Basically, after national liberation, the townships, the villages, the villages, not the townships, the villages are then recolonized, or then finally colonized. Because they represent something anachronistic. They represent a lack of opportunity, a lack of investment. What you want now, it's like you have the agriculturalists, and outside of the agriculturalists, you have the herdsmen. And now, because the agriculturalists got control, got more power, got more weapons, they use them against the herds people to say, your ways are no more. Your ways are gone. Now it is time for agriculture. The same with this colonial system. It's like, okay, you have the colonial system and you have the agriculturalists, and now the colonial system, empowered by African people themselves, says, okay, the ways of agriculture are gone. Now you're working in factories. We have to industrialize. And it makes sense. You do want to industrialize. You do want to get this weaponry. You do want to have smart weapons. You do want all of that stuff. But then the question becomes, at what cost? And what does it take to exact those costs? Because what does it take to execute those costs? Because now that you want the land or you want the workforce that has been denied you, or the workforce that was unnecessary to the colonial system, but you want it now. Or you want the food produced from the villages. You want this now. How do you get it? Because the chief of the village is going to say, hey, look, I have autonomy. I have authority. And it goes other way. I was going to put up this video. I decided not to. I might put it up, though. I was watching this episode of, sometimes when I'm eating, I decide to, put on something to watch. And lately, I've been putting on Star Trek or whatever, right? One of the episodes has this tribe of people. This like white people. They're all white people, but this group of people who've fled their country and just reduced the war or whatever. The point is that the other country, the other planet really is telling them, come back, we'll give you land. And they kind of laugh at this idea and they say, okay, if we get land, we want autonomy. And it slowly becomes, well, when we get autonomy, what we want is a seat on the ruling council. We want a seat on the ruling council. And the other person, the person negotiating against them or whatever, who offered them land, is saying, that's outrageous. How many seats do you want? You want so many seats? But the reality is that that's what it all comes down to. What it all boils down to. If you have autonomy, right, to what extent are you willing to give others? To what extent are you willing to give others? And it really, it's a really magnificent question, a really magnificent viewpoint. But maybe another time we can discuss it. So these setbacks confirm the theoretical analysis of the nationalist parties. The disastrous attempts at regimenting the rural masses reinforce the party's distrust and crystallize their aggressiveness towards this section of the population. After the victorious struggle for national liberation, the same mistakes are repeated, fostering the trend to decentralize and self-govern. The tribalism of the colonial phase is replaced by regionalism in the national phase, expressed institutionally as federalism. So again, that's that ruling council, the ruling authority, so on and so forth. And it becomes that Africa today wants to split apart. It wants to split apart. It wants to, oh, you're part of this ethnic group, I'm part of this ethnic group. I want my own autonomy, and you want your own autonomy, and we just shouldn't share autonomy. And that's a question of itself. But it so happens that the rural masses, in spite of the little control the parties have over them, play a crucial role either in the gestation of the national consciousness or in relaying the initiatives of the nationalist parties, and in some rare cases, taking over purely and simply from the party's sterility. The nationalist party's propaganda always finds a response among the peasantry. The memory of the pre-colonial period is still very much alive in the villages. Mothers still hum to their children the songs which accompany the warriors as they set off to fight the colonizer. At the age of 12 or 13, the young villager knows by heart the names of the elders who took part in the last revolt, and the dreams and the dowries in the villages are not those of the children in the cities dreaming of luxury goods or passing their exams, but dreams of identification with such and such a hero whose heroic death still brings tears to their eyes. At a time when the nationalist parties are endeavoring to organize the embryonic working class in the towns, we are witnessing apparently inexplicable social unrest in the interior. We can take as an example the infamous 1947 insurrection in Madagascar. The colonial services stated categorically that it was a peasant revolt. In fact, we now know that things, as always, were much more complex. During the Second World War, the major colonial companies extended their influence and grabbed any remaining land. There was also talk at the same period of the possible settlement on the island of Jewish, Kabyle, and West Indian refugees. The rumor also spread of an imminent invasion of the island by the whites from South Africa, abetted by the colonists. After the war, therefore, the candidates on the nationalist ticket were triumphantly elected. Immediately afterwards, factions of the MDRM party, Movement Démocrate de la Rénovation Malgache, underwent repression. In order to achieve their ends, the colonial authorities employed the usual methods: mass arrests, intertribal racist propaganda, and the creation of a party with the unorganized factions of the lumpen proletariat. This party, called the Disinherited of Madagascar, PADESM, and its decidedly provocative actions was to provide the colonial authorities with the legal pretext it needed to maintain law and order. Such a premeditated, commonplace operation as eliminating a political party, however, here took on gigantic proportions. On the defensive for 3 or 4 years, the rural masses suddenly felt themselves in mortal danger and decided to violently resist the colonialist forces. Armed with spears and more often with sticks and stones, the population rose up in a widespread revolt with the aim of national liberation. We know how it ended. The thing here is that black people in Madagascar, right? What they're detailing here is how, like, this is one of the things that you do not want. Like, they can settle your your country with whomever they want, because as we talked about yesterday, if they control the borders, then they can send whoever they want whenever they want to you, right? Because you're not controlling your borders. It's like if you have a doorman in your you're in an apartment complex, right? The doorman decides who comes in and who doesn't. And while you might be let in, sure, the reality is that anybody else could be let in at the discretion of this door person, right? And you're basically letting other people be the door people for you. And that's troubling. That's troubling. Because if the door person is working with, nefarious forces, you'll be in trouble. Or you're deceptively safe. So and another thing that happened was, of course, that they created their own political party that gave them a legal pretext towards harming us more so. And that's also another thing. But anyway, let's keep going. Such armed revolts constitute but one of the methods used by the rural masses to join in the national struggle. In some cases, the peasants act as a relay following the unrest in the towns, where the Nationalist Party is the object of police repression. The news reaches the interior exaggerated out of all proportion. Leaders arrested and others gunned down, the city running red with the blood of blacks, the poor settlers swimming in Arab, the poor white settlers swimming in Arab blood. All the pent-up hatred, all the exacerbated hatred then explodes. The local police station is taken over, the officers hacked to pieces, the elementary school teacher murdered, the doctor gets away with his life only because he is absent, etc., etc. Pacifying troops and dispatched to the field, the air forces drops bombs, the banners of revolt is then unfurled, the old warrior tradition resurfaced, the woman cheered on the men who band together and take up their positions in the mountains, and guerrilla warfare begins. Spontaneously, the peasant creates a widespread sense of insecurity. Colonialism takes fright, settles into a state of war, or else negotiates. So, Also see that I have a guest, but I'll just share the screen. But the thing with this is that, yeah. So basically, like, yeah, armed revolt is something that can come about. Uh, it comes about particularly like it's a good thing. It's a good thing. It's one of the things that happens, uh, and it happened here in these circumstances because the leadership uh, was attacked. You know, and I mean, this is like one of those things that I was saying about boxing people in on three sides. You know, how it's advisable to box people in on three sides. You know, give them some sort of outlet. But when you do not give them an outlet, you know, then that's where things can explode. You know, things can explode in your face because you've messed up. You know, um, but again, like, it's all a calculus. Like, life is, realistically speaking, life is calculus. You know, where where you can, say, okay, well, we'll let you have leaders, and then the leaders the leaders can also lead against you. And that's a good thing. It's a good thing for us, obviously, but it's just something to keep in mind, particularly as you become leaders, and then there are, leaders against you, for whatever reason. And what do you do about that is the big question. So how did the nationalist parties react to this decisive eruption by the peasant masses into the national struggle? We have seen the majority of the nationalist parties have not written the need for armed intervention into their propaganda. They are not opposed to a sustained revolt, but they leave it up to the spontaneity of the rural masses. In other words, their attitude towards a new development is as if it were heaven sent. Praying, they continue. They exploit this godsend, but make no attempt to organize a rebellion. They do not dispatch agents to the interior to politicize the masses, to enlighten their consciousness, or raise the struggle to a higher level. They hope that, swept along by its own momentum, the actions of the masses will not flag. There is no contamination of the rural movement by the urban movement. Each side evolves according to its own dialectic. So basically he's saying, this is like something to really understand too, that if you're vulnerable, you don't talk. Like, you don't necessarily talk the talk. You don't really talk the real talk, because you could be got for that. The example that I gave yesterday of this Jackie Chandu character, of this Jackie Chandu person, is just that. He was standing on City Hall or something like that, or the South African City Hall. And he's just standing saying, yeah, let's kill these Indians, pretty much. One bullet, one Indian. One bullet, one Indian. Trending, chanting that. And then they just arrested him. One bullet, one Indian. What Fanon is here saying is that you want the peasants, like, if you're an urban person, you want the peasants to get that, but you don't want to be arrested for it. You understand? So, like, it's kind of like he's saying it comes from prayer. Now, I obviously don't necessarily agree. I think that you should be vocal and say it. But again, there are consequences for, pretty much promoting murder, in a society that abhors the murder of its people, of its own people. Obviously, it doesn't care about the murder of you. But anyway, at a time when, because that's what the rebellion was about, to be honest, they were murdering black people in Phoenix, South Africa. But anyway, at a time when the rural masses are totally receptive, the nationalist parties make no attempt to introduce them to an agenda. They have no objective to offer and simply hope that the movement will continue indefinitely and that the bombardments will not win the day. We thus see that the nationalist parties do not make use of even this opportunity to integrate the rural masses and raise their political awareness, as well as their struggle to a higher level. They stubbornly maintain their criminal position of distrust with regards to the interior. The political cadres hole up in the towns and make it clear to the colonial authorities they have no connection with the rebels, or else leave the country. Seldom do they join forces with the people in the mountains. In Kenya, for example, during the Mau Mau insurrection, no known nationalist claimed he was a member of the movement or attempted to defend it. So, obviously not, because, again, anybody can come arrest you if you're in, like, if they know where you are. Like, it's not complicated. If you say, hey, I took part in, killing so and so, right? Like if you say I took part in killing, John Smith or whatever, right? Then, like, yeah, you'll get arrested. Like if they know where you are, if you're not hiding and you're just bragging about killing somebody, like chances, like this even happened to a musician in America called, I think, Bobby Shmurda, where he's just like, he's literally writing music where he's bragging about who he's killed or something. And so they arrested him. Like it's not complicated. You know what I mean? Like it's really not complicated. Like if people know where you are, like, cause I know people who've done crimes, and what they do is they go into hiding. Like if it's a smaller crime, you try to hide for 7 damn years. You know what I mean? You try to hide, as far as the statute of limitation is concerned. If it's murder, obviously you just don't show your face, or you don't talk about it. But if you're a leader in a nation, you have a house on public record, and you say, yeah, I murdered so and so, then obviously the authorities there, if you're not the authorities yourself, are going to come after you. It's a no brainer. But of course, Fanon is saying, well, why they're not doing it? They're not, like, it's like, yeah, because it's a no brainer. Yeah, it's a no-brainer. There are no constructive talks, no confrontation between the different social strata of the nation. Once independence has been achieved after repression of the rural masses and collusion between the colonial authorities and the national parties, we find their mutual incomprehension exacerbated. The peasantry balk at the structural reforms proposed by the government, as well as the even objectively progressive social innovations, precisely because the current leaders of the regime did not explain to the people during the colonial period the party's objectives, national policy, and international issues, etc. So that's also a pretty important thing, that a lot of times the leaders of political parties are not explaining the deeper things. Like, what are the objectives, so on and so forth. Like, sure, they're against being colonized, but what is decolonization? The mistrust felt by the rural population and the traditional leaders towards the nationalist parties during the colonial period is matched by equal hostility during the national period. The colonialist secret service, which is still at work after independence, foments discontent and still manages to create serious difficulties for the young government. When all is said and done, the government is merely paying for its idleness during the liberation period and its enduring contempt for the peasantry. The nation may well have a rational, even progressive head, but its huge body remains retarded, rebellious, and recalcitrant. So anyway, that's you get what this is. This is all is said and done, the merely paying for its idleness during the liberation period. Yeah, enduring the contempt of the peasantry. Like, basically what he's saying here, and that even like changing the head of the colonial system, right, is not going to change the whole body, because, and of course it's probably never going to change the body because you're still in a colonial system. You just happen to change the head. It's like, the example I like is this example of, let's say you're on a plantation, right? You kill the leader of the plantation, you kill the enslaver, right? You kill the other proprietor of the plantation owner. You kill the plantation owner. Then if somebody among your group says, okay, so now I'm the plantation owner, right? And we're going to keep the social arrangement. We're still going to work, sun up to sun down. We're still going to do everything. It's just that now I'm the plantation owner. It's perfectly understandable for the people who didn't like getting whipped, or who didn't like having limited food, or didn't like not getting paid, are not necessarily gleeful or embracing this idea of, oh, okay, sure, like, yeah, this is much better. Like, people may try to convince you that it's better, and it is better, so I'm one of those people who might try to convince you, but it's, realistically speaking, it's not what you would have wanted. It's not that freedom, and that right there is one of those questions, one of those concerns, one of those concepts that we as a people should address in the here and now, but we don't actually, we're more so, kill the plantation owner. Sure. How do you feed these people after? What is the system in place to feed these people after? Because if you're like, hey, the wealth of cotton trading should come to us, or the wealth of tobacco trading, or the wealth of, let's say, cocaine trading, whatever, who cares? If that should come back to us, how do we do not have the networks. We don't have people wanting to do business with us. We don't have people who are wanting to buy cotton from us. So how do we do this? That's what I would leave you all with. That's page 72. So I appreciate that. It does turn out that the podcast does go faster without I didn't know it did. But I actually thought it was would have been the same amount of time. But it looks like I'm half as long. But I appreciate everybody for coming through. Appreciate everybody for listening. Please join me tomorrow for this podcast. And until next time, I'm going to say to everybody, Shem Yem Hotep. And of course, you're appreciated. Peace.